My fiancé's mom called me unsuitable and ruined our wedding. Years later, she begged me for mercy. When Nathan proposed to me under a golden canopy of autumn trees in the park where we first met, I thought my life was finally aligning with the fairy tale I never dared to dream. I was 27, a quiet librarian who found peace between pages and meaning in simplicity. He was everything I wasn't: assertive, charismatic, and born into a family of well-known lawyers and judges. His world was polished and old-moneyed, mine humble and ordinary. Still, he held my hand and said he loved me just the way I was. For a moment, I believed that love alone could bridge the difference between our worlds. But that belief began to crack the day I was first introduced to his family, particularly his mother. Margaret Whitmore was every bit the matriarch her last name implied: sharp cheekbones, eyes that scanned rather than looked, and a voice that dripped with elegance but struck like ice. She barely concealed her disapproval. "You work in a public library?" she asked with a smile so small it could have been a twitch. "How quaint." Nathan brushed it off, whispering in my ear later that she'd come around. But I felt something that day, something brittle and unforgiving in the air between us. I smiled through the discomfort, clutching my coffee cup tighter than I needed to. The invitation into their family had not been extended with warmth. I was being tolerated, not welcomed. The second time I visited the Whitmore estate, it was for a formal family dinner. I wore a navy dress, ironed and chosen with care, and brought Margaret a bouquet of hydrangeas, her favorite, according to Nathan. She accepted them with a nod but handed them off to a maid without looking at them again. Throughout dinner, I became a silent observer of their world. Conversations moved quickly: law, investments, family friends with surnames that carried weight, and I sat quietly, trying to find a place for myself. When I offered my thoughts on a local library's literacy program, Margaret interrupted with a chuckle. "Libraries are lovely for children and the elderly. But darling, don't you think your time would be better spent doing something relevant?" The rest of the table laughed lightly. I smiled, pretending not to feel the sting, but Nathan's silence next to me burned more than her words. He didn't defend me. He just shifted uncomfortably and changed the subject. The car ride home was even worse. I waited, hoping he would acknowledge the cruelty, say something, anything, but he only said, "She'll warm up, eventually. She's protective, that's all." I stared out the window, swallowing the lump in my throat. I told myself this was the cost of entering a different world. I would be patient. I would prove I belonged. But in that moment, I wasn't sure if I was trying to marry a man, or gain admission into an institution that had already decided I didn't meet the standard. In the months leading up to our wedding, the weekly family dinners became a ritual I dreaded. Nathan insisted I attend, saying it was important for me to be seen as part of the family, but each dinner left me feeling smaller. Margaret found new ways to diminish me with a smile. "Did you ever consider law school? Or was college too much already?" she asked one night while passing the potatoes. Nathan laughed nervously, squeezing my knee under the table, as if that would erase the humiliation. Even his sisters, Meredith and Elise, joined in the game. "You'll have to get used to real parties, Caroline," Elise said, sipping wine. "The Whitmore galas aren't book club socials." I felt like a character in a play I hadn't auditioned for, every gesture scrutinized, every word weighed. I would rehearse in front of the mirror before dinners, practicing polite responses and neutral expressions. Still, I never passed their test. What hurt most was Nathan's growing passivity. Where once he would light up around me, now he seemed torn, like a man trying to live two lives. "Don't let it get to you," he'd say afterward. "It's just their way." But their way chipped at me piece by piece. I wasn't being welcomed into a family. I was being asked to endure one. The wedding planning should have been a joyful time, filled with cake tastings and seating charts. Instead, it became a battlefield of control. Margaret dismissed every suggestion I made, from the choice of venue to the color of the table runners. "White roses are overdone," she said flatly, replacing them with orchids. I wasn't even consulted about the guest list. When I asked Nathan, he shrugged. It's her way of feeling involved. My opinion became a courtesy, not a necessity. The final blow came when Margaret refused to help finance the wedding. If Nathan insists on marrying her, she told her husband loudly over dinner, then he can fund the circus himself. I held back tears until we were in the car. She called our wedding a circus, I whispered, voice cracking. Nathan sighed. She didn't mean it like that. But how many ways could those words be interpreted? Each time he minimized her behavior, I lost a little more faith in us. I began to wonder if love was enough when the person you loved couldn't stand up for you. But I didn't walk away. I told myself that once the wedding passed, things would settle. I convinced myself that if I smiled enough, stayed quiet enough, and endured just a bit longer, I could still become a part of this family. But my smile had become a mask I wore out of habit, not happiness. I found my wedding dress on a quiet Thursday afternoon, tucked away in a small boutique far from the glossy bridal salons Margaret recommended. It wasn't extravagant, but it was elegant, a soft satin A-line with lace along the sleeves. When I tried it on, I saw myself the way I had always wanted to be, graceful, strong, and worthy. I brought a photo to show Margaret, hoping, despite everything, for some acknowledgement. She took one glance and said, "Is that it?" "It looks like something from a department store." The silence that followed stung louder than the words. I clutched the photo as she turned away, uninterested. Nathan was in the room but said nothing. Again. "It's what I want," I said, more to myself than to them. I paid for the dress in installments with money I had saved for a trip we never took. I kept it hidden in my apartment closet, away from their judgment. As I zipped it into its garment bag, I felt pride and loneliness. It was the dress I would wear to declare love, in front of people who didn't believe I deserved it. Still, I held on to hope that on the day itself, things would be different. That when Margaret saw me walking down the aisle, she'd finally see what Nathan saw in me. But some people choose not to see, no matter how bright the light. A week before the wedding, I noticed something strange. Friends I had invited, colleagues from the library, my college roommate, even my neighbor Mrs. Halloway, were all sending apologetic messages, saying they hadn't received their invitations or thought the wedding had been canceled. Confused, I checked with the post office, then with Nathan. He looked up from his phone and said he'd let his mother handle the mailing of the invites to their side. She offered, he added casually, as if that meant I shouldn't question it. My stomach turned. I had personally handed over the guest list with clear instructions. But now, the stack of RSVP cards was thinner than it should have been. Out of curiosity, and growing suspicion, I checked the guest registry for the venue. My list had been edited. Whole pages were missing. Names I had written were nowhere to be found, replaced by names I didn't even recognize. Law partners, socialites, distant cousins I'd never heard of. Margaret's fingerprints were all over it. When I confronted Nathan, he winced. She just thought a more refined list would make the wedding look better. His words fell like bricks. Better for who? Not for me. My friends, my support, my people, erased. This was no longer our wedding. It was a staged event, curated for image, not for love. The wedding day arrived draped in gray skies, an omen I ignored. My hair was done, my dress zipped, and my bouquet of lilies trembled slightly in my hand as I waited in the side room of the church. I remember looking in the mirror and barely recognizing myself. I looked elegant, yes, but also fragile. There was a tremor in my smile, a tightness in my throat. I wanted to believe everything would be fine once I walked down the aisle. But that illusion shattered when the doors opened, not to welcome me, but to introduce Margaret's interruption. She stood at the altar with a microphone in hand, smiling like a queen addressing her subjects. "I want to say a few words," she said. "Marriage is a union between equals. between families that understand legacy, tradition, and honor. Today, I fear we're celebrating something else, a mistake in a cheap dress. Gasps rippled through the room. I stood frozen, bouquet wilting. Nathan's face turned pale, and he didn't speak. He didn't stop her. He didn't move. I looked around, searching for someone to object, to defend me, but no one did. No one. Margaret turned to the guests, still smiling, and said, "We can all pretend this is a celebration, or we can admit what it truly is." That was when I dropped my flowers and walked out. No ceremony. No vows. Just silence. I stepped into the cold air, wedding heels sinking into damp pavement. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to leave. The sounds behind me, murmurs, camera shutters, hushed laughter, faded as I moved further from the church. My hands trembled as I yanked off the veil, tossing it into the trash bin outside a convenience store. I flagged a cab, climbed in, and whispered my aunt's address. The driver looked at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes softening as they took in the dress and the tears I was failing to wipe fast enough. He didn't ask questions. Thank God for that. When I reached my aunt's place, I stood on the porch in silence, unsure of how to ring the bell. How do you tell someone you've just been publicly destroyed? But when she opened the door, her expression said everything. She had seen the photos, the video. It was already online. "Come inside," she said softly, pulling me in and shutting the world out. I collapsed onto the couch, still wearing the dress. I didn't cry right away. I just stared blankly. I didn't feel like a person. I felt like debris, something broken and left behind. That night, I removed the dress in silence, hung it in her basement closet, and made a vow to myself, no one would ever see me that helpless again. In the days that followed, I heard nothing from Nathan. No call. No text. No explanation. The man I was supposed to marry disappeared into silence, as if his guilt had swallowed him whole, or worse, as if he felt none. Instead, it was Meredith, his sister, who messaged me 3 days later. It wasn't personal. Mom was just looking out for the family. That was it. That was their apology. No recognition of the pain, no shame for what they'd done. Just a cold, calculated attempt to erase me, like I had never mattered. Like I was an embarrassing misstep in their perfect lineage. My friends rallied behind me when they learned the truth. Most of them hadn't received invitations because Margaret had deliberately removed them from the list. One by one, they came to my aunt's house with flowers, food, and fierce hugs. My roommate from college brought wine and screamed into the void with me. My old boss from the library called and offered my job back, even said I could start part-time if I needed to recover. And slowly, painfully, I began to understand, the people who mattered had never stopped loving me. I hadn't lost everything, I'd simply been freed from something that never truly embraced me. I packed the remnants of that chapter of my life into cardboard boxes. Photos. Stationery with my would-be initials. The guest book no one signed. The ring, I left that on the bathroom counter of my aunt's house and never looked back. I moved to a new city, one with tall libraries, quiet parks, and no memories of the Whitmores. I got a job at the university library and began a graduate program in archival science. I buried myself in books, in purpose, in solitude. Healing didn't come like a sunrise, it came in flickers, slow and unsure, but it came. Every now and then, I'd see a wedding photo online, or overhear a conversation about in-laws, and feel that familiar pang in my chest. But over time, it dulled. I stopped blaming myself. I stopped wondering if I could have done more. I hadn't lost love. I'd lost a performance. A charade. And as painful as that realization was, it set me free. I promised myself that if I ever stood at the altar again, it would be with someone who didn't just love me, but fought for me. Because no vow, no ceremony, no family name is worth enduring silence in the face of cruelty. I moved into a modest apartment above a used bookstore on the east side of the city. The building smelled like old wood and rain-soaked pages, and I loved it for exactly that reason. It felt honest. Real. I threw myself into my work at the university library, curating rare manuscripts and building archives that preserved other people's stories, even as I carefully began to rewrite my own. I kept to myself in those first months, polite with coworkers, but distant. Trust was something I wasn't ready to offer freely again, not after how easily mine had been shattered. But the books didn't betray me. They sat quietly on their shelves, waiting. I took comfort in their permanence. The graduate program consumed most of my time, and I was grateful for the distraction. I studied late, worked weekends, and found solace in silence. Slowly, I built a new routine. Mornings started with black coffee and journal entries. Nights ended with annotated bibliographies and long walks through the campus gardens. I wasn't happy yet. But I was stable. And after what I'd been through, stability was a victory. One Thursday afternoon, I was shelving materials in the university's special collections wing when I was called to the dean's office. I assumed it had something to do with a misplaced document or a missed policy update. But instead, I was met by a man in a charcoal suit who introduced himself as Dr. Miles Carrington, a visiting director from the National Literacy Initiative. He had read an article I'd written for the university journal about early childhood access to libraries. "Your perspective was refreshing," he said. "We're forming a national task force. I think your voice could make a real difference." I stared at him, stunned. I had written that piece on a rainy Sunday, more as catharsis than anything else. I had poured into it everything I knew about the power of access, how books could change a child's future, how literacy had saved me during the darkest chapters of my life. And now this man was offering me a seat at the table. I thanked him with a shaking voice and accepted. As I walked back to my office, my heart raced, not with fear, but with something that had been dormant for too long. Purpose. A month later, the initiative launched publicly, and I was one of the featured speakers in a live-streamed panel. I wore a simple navy blazer, my hair pulled back, my voice steady as I spoke about community, resilience, and the importance of storytelling. The feedback was overwhelming. Emails poured in, messages from teachers, librarians, single mothers, even former students. "You made me feel seen," one wrote. "I thought I was the only one. I saved every message." For the first time, the very parts of myself that had once been considered unworthy were now seen as strengths. Then, I got a phone call from a reporter at a local news station. They wanted to do a segment on my work, especially my story of personal reinvention. I hesitated. I didn't want pity. I didn't want my past to overshadow my present. But the reporter promised compassion, and something in me whispered, maybe it's time. When the piece aired, I didn't cry. I watched quietly as photos of my childhood, my old library job, and my new life flashed across the screen. And somewhere in a small town far away, I knew the Whitmores were watching too. Not long after the news segment, I received a letter. It was handwritten in cursive I recognized immediately. Margaret. My hands trembled as I opened it. The note was brief, almost stiff. She had seen the interview. She congratulated me on my success. And then, in one line near the bottom, she asked if we could meet. "I'd appreciate the chance to speak in person," she wrote. No apology. No mention of the wedding. Just a request. I stared at the letter for a long time before folding it back into the envelope. I didn't respond immediately. Part of me wanted to ignore it completely. But another part, the part that had grown stronger, wanted something else. Not revenge. Not closure. Understanding. I was no longer the woman who had begged for their approval. I was no longer their scapegoat. I could walk into that meeting not with shame, but with power. So, after 3 days of deliberation, I replied with a single sentence, I will meet you once. I signed my name with the same steadiness I now carried in my voice. We met at the county courthouse downtown. She was seated on a bench outside, coat draped over her knees, hair thinner and face more tired than I remembered. She looked up and flinched when she saw me, as if unsure whether I was real. Caroline, she said, standing quickly. I didn't offer my hand. I just sat beside her, leaving space between us. Thank you for coming, she said quietly. For a moment, we sat in silence, the sound of footsteps and distant traffic filling the air between us. Then, she spoke. She told me Nathan had moved overseas, that their firm had lost a major client, that the family was struggling. He doesn't speak to me anymore, she admitted. He blames me for everything. Her voice cracked for the first time. She looked at me, not with pride or judgment, but something else entirely. Regret. I treated you terribly, she whispered. I thought I was protecting my son. But I see now /. I destroyed him. And I destroyed you too. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just listened. And when she asked, with trembling lips, if I could ever forgive her, I finally looked her in the eye and said, I forgave you the day I stopped needing your approval. Margaret's face crumpled when I said those words. She looked older than I remembered, older than she should have been for her age. Her shoulders sagged beneath the weight of her own decisions. I understand, she murmured, folding her hands in her lap. You don't owe me anything. We sat in silence for a while, not as family, not even as enemies, but as two women burdened by the past. Finally, she confessed the truth. Nathan had cut ties with her a year ago. He blamed her for what happened at the wedding, but even more than that, he resented what she'd turned him into. She explained that after he left the country, the family business began to crumble. A series of poor investments, followed by lawsuits, stripped them of their assets. I never thought we'd fall like this, she said. The house is gone. I'm staying with a distant cousin in the meantime, but that won't last. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I came to the courthouse today for help filing for bankruptcy. I don't have money for legal representation. I've exhausted everything. And then she said something I never expected. You're the only person I trust to tell me the truth now. I walked home from the courthouse with my thoughts swirling, the city lights bouncing off the windows like tiny reminders that everything moves forward, whether we're ready or not. Part of me wanted to turn away from it all, to leave Margaret in the shadows she created for herself. But the other part, the part of me that had once been dragged through dirt and heels and lace, understood something deeper. I wasn't doing this for her. I was doing this for the girl they had discarded. For the girl they said didn't belong. I couldn't undo what they did to her, but I could refuse to let it define who I became. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold and wrote a letter. Not to Margaret, but to myself. It was the letter I had needed the night I left that church. I wrote about worth, not the kind tied to last names or guest lists, but the kind you carry quietly, in your spine, in your choices. I reminded myself that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it shows up in silence, in grace, in the ability to look your past in the eye and not flinch. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. A small reminder that I had survived, and more than that, I had risen. I didn't offer Margaret a place to stay. I didn't offer her money either. But I did call a legal aid nonprofit and arranged for her to meet with one of their pro bono attorneys. She looked at me with a stunned kind of gratitude when I told her. Why would you do that? She asked, her voice cracking. After everything? I didn't answer right away. I just said, because it's the right thing to do. And maybe because, deep down, I wanted her to see that the woman she once saw as a threat, as unsuitable, was now the very one standing beside her when no one else would. I watched her walk into the building alone, her steps uncertain, her pride left behind. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel pity. What I felt was peace. For the first time, I wasn't acting from pain or revenge, I was acting from strength. Margaret never apologized formally again. She didn't offer grand confessions or ask for a second chance at family. She knew those bridges were ash. But she did something else. When the paperwork was done and her case was filed, she turned to me outside the building and said, "I hope you have someone in your life who deserves you. I hope they fight for you." 2 months later, I received an email from Nathan. The subject line read, "Can we talk?" I sat still for a long moment, staring at the screen. He said he'd returned from Europe, had been working with a non-profit and needed clarity. I saw the news segment, he wrote. "You were extraordinary." And I realized I was a coward. I let them destroy something real. He wanted to meet. He wanted to apologize. I thought about it for days. There was a time when I would have given anything to hear those words from him. A time when I would have dropped everything for even a hint of regret. But that time had passed. When we met at a quiet cafe, he looked thinner, older. His eyes searched mine for something familiar, but I wasn't the woman he left behind. I listened as he spoke, about his regrets, his shame, his guilt. "I should have stood up for you," he said. "I see that now." I nodded. "You did what you were taught to do," I replied. "But I'm no longer the girl waiting to be chosen." He blinked, stunned. "You don't want to try again?" he asked. I smiled gently. I did try. Alone. And that was enough to build something better without you. After Nathan left the cafe, I sat alone with my tea, staring at the window and watching the rain thread its way down the glass. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't even sad. I felt whole. I had spent so long trying to win the approval of a family that never saw me. Now, I was surrounded by people who respected me, students who quoted me, colleagues who listened when I spoke. I had found my own voice, and it was louder and clearer than I had ever imagined it could be. That week, I was invited to speak at a national conference for women in leadership. My session was titled, "Reclaiming the Narrative." As I stood at the podium, lights hot on my face, I looked out at the audience and remembered that scared young woman who had once been dragged across a porch with her dignity shredded. I thought of how she had risen. And I spoke not just to the crowd, but to every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. Because I knew, now more than ever, that no one could erase you if you refused to disappear. After the conference, I returned to my apartment and found a small envelope in my mailbox. No name, just my address handwritten with a familiar stiffness. Inside was a simple thank you card, from Margaret. For the referral. And for not turning your back on me when I deserved it most. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a signature. I set it down on my kitchen table and sat with it for a long time. There was no sense of victory, no thrill in seeing her broken. What I felt was deeper than that, liberation. I had made a decision not to become like them. And that meant something. The next day, I received a call from the dean. A national grant had been approved, and I'd been nominated to lead a pilot program for underserved high school libraries across the state. It would require me to relocate again, this time to oversee teams, manage budgets, and advocate on a much larger scale. I accepted without hesitation. Not because I was running away from the past, but because I was finally moving towards something that belonged entirely to me. For the first time in years, I felt like the author of my own life again. Before leaving the city, I decided to stop by one last place, the coffee shop where Nathan and I had our first real date. It was still there, same old crooked sign and mismatched chairs. I ordered a black coffee and sat at the table where we used to sit, letting the memory pass through me without pain. A young couple sat 2 tables over, laughing softly, the way we once did. It didn't hurt. It didn't sting. I had lived through a heartbreak that could have broken me, and came out stronger, clearer, and more whole than I'd ever been. As I stirred my coffee, I thought about all the things I used to believe were permanent: love, reputation, family roles. But now I understood that the only thing truly permanent was growth, if we chose it. That morning, I left the coffee shop not with sorrow, but with gratitude. Gratitude for everything that had shaped me. Even the bruises. Especially the bruises. They had taught me where to stand tall, and where never to kneel again. A week before my move, I received a call from the legal aid office. Margaret had officially completed her bankruptcy filing. She had also begun volunteering part-time at a local community center, offering administrative help. She asked me to let you know, the woman said. I was silent for a moment. Thank you, I replied, and hung up. It was strange to think of her now, not as a villain, but as a woman unraveling slowly, piecing herself together in small, almost invisible ways. I never spoke to Margaret again. She never asked for another meeting, and I never offered. But I followed her progress quietly from a distance. I wasn't seeking validation. I just wanted to know that maybe, somewhere along the way, the woman who once tried to erase me had finally found value in what she had rejected. Maybe she'd learned something about humility. Maybe not. Either way, I had already let go. And letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant I could finally live without looking over my shoulder. At my farewell party, one of my graduate students handed me a leather-bound journal. Inside, on the first page, they had written, "To Caroline, the woman who taught us that your voice matters, even when no one else hears it." My throat tightened. That name, Caroline. It wasn't just a name anymore. It had once been dragged across marble floors, whispered in mockery, dismissed by cold smiles. But now it stood for something else. For resilience. For truth. For everything I had rebuilt from the ashes of humiliation. I flipped through the journal later that night in my empty apartment, reading the handwritten notes from my team. Words like fearless, integrity, grace. They didn't know what I had survived. They only saw what I had become. And maybe that was the most beautiful part. I was no longer defined by the pain, but by the path I carved through it. My name no longer carried shame. It carried story. One I would never allow anyone else to rewrite. The morning I moved, I stood at the edge of the river downtown, the one that ran behind the campus gardens. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long golden streaks across the water. I remembered walking this path on the day I started over, my heart still cracked and my pride in pieces. I remembered how heavy my feet had felt then, dragging memories behind them like chains. Now, I stood lighter. Not because the past had disappeared, but because I had stopped carrying it like a wound. As I watched the current, I thought of all the women like me, those who had been dismissed, underestimated, laughed at, or left behind. I thought of what it meant to rebuild quietly, without applause. To rise without revenge. To forgive without forgetting. I wasn't proud of the pain, but I was proud of the person who walked through it and didn't turn to stone. I turned away from the water, set my bags in the car, and drove off, not to escape, but to expand. To live more. Because now, I finally could. 6 months into my new role, I was thriving. The literacy pilot program exceeded every target, and schools that had once struggled now had access to shelves full of books and teachers with the resources to guide young minds. I was invited to another speaking event, this time a national summit on educational equity. Afterward, as I mingled with attendees, someone tapped my shoulder. "Caroline?" I turned, and to my surprise, it was Elise, Nathan's sister. Her expression was unreadable. "I've been following your work," she said. "You've become impressive." I didn't know what to say. Part of me waited for the sarcasm, the judgment I remembered so well. But none came. She hesitated, then added, "We were wrong. About you. All of us." It wasn't an apology. Not really. But it was more than I had ever expected. I know, I replied calmly. Her eyes darted away, her voice softer now. Nathan's never been the same. He said losing you was the moment he realized he didn't know who he was without his mother's approval. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Some realizations come too late. And some things, once broken, stay that way. A week later, I received one final letter. This time from Nathan. It wasn't an email, not a message online, but an actual handwritten letter in familiar, careful script. He poured his heart into those pages, pages filled with apologies, with memories, with longing. He said he still dreamed of the life we almost had. He asked if I ever thought about it too. I was afraid, he wrote. Afraid of disappointing my family. Afraid of being wrong. But I was wrong, Caroline. About everything. And I never stopped loving you. I held the letter in my hands for hours. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I finally did. I remembered the version of me who would have cried reading those words, who would have reached for a second chance. But that version no longer lived here. I folded the letter, slid it into a drawer, and never wrote back. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Love built on fear is no love at all. He had loved me when it was easy. I had become a woman who needed more than that. That fall, I was nominated for a National Education Award and invited to a formal gala in the capital. As I stood on the stage in a long emerald gown, applause echoing in the ballroom, I felt a strange wave of stillness inside me. Not nerves. Not pride. Just quiet strength. The kind I had spent years building. I looked into the crowd and saw faces beaming back at me, teachers, students, advocates. People who had walked beside me, believed in me, lifted me. After the ceremony, I stepped outside for air. The city lights glittered, and the wind pulled gently at my hair. For a moment, I remembered the church steps. The feel of the veil slipping from my hands. The pain. The shame. I closed my eyes and let it drift away. That version of Caroline had not just survived. She had become someone extraordinary. Someone who took everything that was meant to break her and built a life too solid to be shaken again. Months later, I received a package. No return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping, a local piece titled "Former Matriarch Rebuilds After Loss." It was about Margaret. It detailed her volunteer work, her quiet life in a shared apartment, her work helping other elderly women navigate legal paperwork. A photo accompanied it, her eyes softer now, hands folded in her lap. Attached was a note in careful handwriting. Some stories don't end with applause. But they can still find peace. I stared at the photo for a long time. Not out of spite or vengeance, but with something I never expected to feel, release. She would never undo the past. But she had faced it. And maybe, in her own way, had begun to rewrite herself too. I placed the photo in a box labeled "Unfinished Chapters" and slid it under my bed. Not forgotten. Just no longer taking space on my shelves. Years later, I stood in front of a classroom full of girls from every background imaginable. I told them stories, not just from books, but from life. I told them that worth was not something others give you. It's something you declare, even when no one listens. I told them that sometimes, you won't be believed, supported, or protected. But that doesn't mean you fold. It means you grow louder, stronger, wiser. And that no matter how the world tries to silence you, your story matters. When class ended, one student lingered. "Ms. Carter," she said softly, "how did you become so strong?" I smiled, placing a hand over my heart. By remembering who I was before they tried to tell me who to be. As I watched her walk away, backpack bouncing behind her, I felt a quiet satisfaction rise within me. Not revenge. Not even triumph. Just peace. Because in the end, I didn't just survive what they did to me. I turned it into something beautiful.